back to Storytime with Dave Booker. Appreciate you coming back. Today we're going to continue on with Time Is, first book in the Time Is series. So we did meanderings, and we're going to continue on. So the next chapter is Home Once More. The quotation is, "The ache for home lives in all of us. The safe place where we can go as we are and not be questioned." That's by Maya Angelou. All God's children need traveling shoes. When I walked through the portal, the first thing I saw was that a few changes had happened. His living court section was expanded. He had installed a new clawfoot tub in the corner. He had partitioned his personal bathroom off with a curtain similar to the ones they have in hospital rooms. I was also surprised to see carpet on the floor and 2 new bookshelves on the wall. He even had a larger fridge. "How in hell did you do all this in one night?" I exclaimed. Scott looked at me and shook his head. "Don't think about it and tell me how I did it." Suddenly I realized that what he'd done. He had traveled back to just after we had left and did all this in 3 days instead of one night. He guessed I had figured it out and smiled. "There are advantages to having time at your disposal." I was wondering where and, of course, when our next excursion would take us, but when I looked at Scott again, I noticed his cold had gotten worse. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, and he was paler than normal. There was also a sniffle quality to his voice. "Scott, why don't we take a break for a while?" He smiled but shook his head. "I have to go to Egypt for about a week and check on something a friend told me about. In the meantime, I think you might enjoy taking a trip by yourself. Can you think of any time you might enjoy exploring?" I wanted to give him an answer right away, but was stumped. "Can I have tonight to think about it?" "Of course," he agreed. "I don't fly it out until Wednesday, but so you have 2 days to decide. Come back when you're ready and we'll set everything up." I promised to be back the next day so we would have enough time. All the way home, I tried to think of what criteria would best help me. By the time I got home, I had a fair idea of the things I would have to list. I stepped into the diner for dinner. After all the meals I'd had from 1775, something more up-to-date was welcome. I had a nice sirloin steak, baked potatoes, and green beans with ham, salad, pecan pie. Then I went upstairs and sat up for most of the night making a list. Excuse me, sorry. My voice is really bad today. Okay. I knew certain things would be important. First and foremost would be language. The place and period would have to speak English, or at least close to it. I thought of going back to places we had already visited. I was deciding on either Shakespeare's time or Revolutionary time. By flipping a penny, it landed on heads. As I looked at the penny, a thought occurred to me. What would it be like to spend time in New Salem with Lincoln? He was a shopkeeper there amongst a lot of other jobs, and he would have been in his 20s then. Let's see, Lincoln was born in 1809, so 1832 should be a good year for a visit. I visited the town of New Salem when I was in high school and understood it was as close to what it looked like as they could make it, so I should recognize a great deal. Yeah, that was going to be my choice. That night, lying in my own bed seemed so different that I couldn't sleep and spent an hour to reacquainting myself with everything. I looked around and saw many things that were useless, broken, or that I never used. Seemed like a good time to tidy up a bit. I started by getting rid of trash first. Old newspapers, magazines, boxes of cords, odds and ends from drawers, etc. Next, got rid of things I didn't use. This emptied a lot in my kitchen, including a noodle press, a ravioli press, and an ice cream maker. Bedroom next. Not much here, surprisingly. The bathroom was okay too. The living area had lots of knickknacks that went, but some that meant a bit to me stayed, including a small collection of music boxes. Now, since it was a studio apartment, all these things, areas were in one room, so it didn't take a long time to get things sorted out. The only thing I didn't even consider parting with were my books. With the shelves cleaned, I resorted and restacked my collection. I got out my books on Lincoln and New Salem and studied those closer. I'd have to know something useful if we were going to be there for a while. I'd enjoyed the glimpse of working as a blacksmith. Went online and watched some videos on making horseshoes, skillets, fence railings, all sorts of things. I rewatched the ones I thought would be most useful and then realized I couldn't claim to really know how to do this unless I did it. I wonder if I could go back and work with Josephus again. Seemed like a nice guy and surely wouldn't turn down more assistants, especially if they were free. I wanted to check with Scott tomorrow. My bad, it's already tomorrow. So 300 and I wanted to be at the lab by 0800. Hopped into bed and broke the headboard. Well, nothing to do about that now. I tried my best to go to sleep and finally did so at about 4. 7 saw me up and ready. I stopped in the diner and got 2 to-go trays of pancakes, sausage, fried eggs, and coffee. I arrived back at the lab on time and was extremely surprised by Scott. He was completely cured, not just better, but more cheerful. Must have had a comically surprised look on my face because Scott stood there laughing at me. Sit up at the table and tell each other our adventures. Excuse me. Scott sat down with his hands folded over his stomach and a look on his face I couldn't understand. Then it hit me. He now had a mustache and beard. His hair is gray, so I didn't see it at first. Then I realized he has been jumping around time again. So you've already been to Egypt? I didn't have to ask, but he would expect me to. Yep, I figured I could use Fred and be back today. I spent 2 days there to see what I came to. Then went to Rome and spent a few months learning Latin and Greek, plus early customs, etc. I just got back this morning, about 5 minutes before you got here. Wondered how often Scott had used Fred while I was not here, and why had he suddenly named the time machine Fred? Well, the only way to get an answer was to ask. I've been doing some extensive travels, garnering information, seeing a few things I wanted, and even needed to see. Hope you understand. I was a little hurt that I hadn't been invited and must have shown it. Then it hit me that I didn't have anything to be upset about. Fred was his, and he was kind enough to be taking me with him, even offering to send me on my own. Thank you, Donnie. He started eating once he saw the conclusion I had drawn. I'm only trying to use what time I have at my disposal as best I can. By the way, you may be curious as to why I've named our time machine Fred. It's a simple expedient if we have to discuss it in front of people. I like the way he said our time machine, because knowing Scott, he really meant it. I told Scott about where and when I wanted to go and what I wanted to do. Sounds good, and I agree that honing your skills in blacksmithing may be to your advantage. Would you mind very much if I came too? Since my trip is already completed, I'm available to accompany you, or you may, of course, go alone if you so desire. I grinned as I replied, someone close to me once said, a trip is more enjoyable if shared with another. We got into our gear, and Scott set Fred for 2 days after we had left. We were just going to step through when Scott yelped and closed the portal down. What the heck, Scott? What's wrong? Scott ran to the bathroom. I gotta shave. He came out clean shaven as he was when we had visited the first time. I understood his panic. People don't grow a beard that fast. Once again, we checked into the inn. We dodged questions about our short trip and went back to our rooms. Luckily, they were still unoccupied. I think the person who I said 1 minute to when I left was the same person who came in to light my fire. As she lit it, she kept looking back at me curiously, as if she wanted to ask me a question or had something on her mind. The fire lit, she stood with the doorknob in her hand. She looked at me searchingly but said nothing and went out the door. I turned back to the window and the door burst open. "All right, I have to know how you did it." She had come in so quickly that she was at my side, pulling me around before I realized she came back in. "I know I heard your voice in here. I know it. But when I came in, you were gone." She had me by the lapels and was looking at me straight in the eyes. Thought I was going to go insane, but you were in here. I heard you. I took hold of her hands and said as gently as I could, "I'm sorry if what I did caused you distress. I mean, I meant no harm and was only joking." I looked in her eyes and she appeared to be calming down. "But how did you do it?" She was persistent. I thought fast. "I was in the next room over with my friend. I heard you go through the wall and thought it would be funny. I'm deeply sorry if it distressed you." She held my eyes with hers and placing her hand on the side of my face, tilted it down to hers. Her heart started racing as she slowly raised her lips to mine. I closed my eyes as I felt her hand slowly drawing down from my face. Next thing I know, I felt a stinging slap on my right cheek. "Don't do that again," she admonished. I realized my father had been right. Never piss off a redhead. She stomped to the door. I just stood there with my mouth half open. She looked at me and standing stupidly and came back and gave me a warmest kiss I have ever had and waltzed out the door. I was becoming very confused. I went next door to get Scott. "Oh, so that's why you wanted to come back," he said, laughing. He pulled out a handkerchief and wiped my face. "I don't leave any broken hearts here, all right?" "Scott, I have not the slightest idea of what just happened." I felt like I was a kid who had just gotten his first kiss. Scott patted me on the shoulder, as he always did when he felt like a father towards me. "Come on, we have people to do and things to see." I couldn't help but laugh. We went down and walked down to the dock. We had to wait a few minutes for the barge to arrive and talked about how we would arrange things. Scott wanted to rent out the barn area and set up to take care of horses. He figured with the races going on, he could get some business and he could stable them, feed them and water, possibly exercise. In the meantime, I would garner all the experience I could as an apprentice blacksmith. Sorry, excuse me. Okay. Soon the barge arrived up to the dock. This early, we were the only passengers, and I sat on a couple of backs while Scott talked to the barge driver, or whatever you call them. Scott handed him a $5 bill and asked him to come to the blacksmith's later that evening. He said he had a business proposition to discuss with him. "My name's Dan Jr., sir, and I don't rightly figure I should take your money till we discuss what you want. Take it back, and if we come to an agreement, I can collect it then." Scott looked admiringly at him. "You, sir, are the kind of man I can do business with. I look forward to coming to an arrangement with you." I wanted to ask a question of Scott, but he shushed me with his hands. I figured we could talk about it later. When the barge docked, we made our way to the blacksmith's. I introduced Scott to Josephus, and Josephus pointed me to the shop after I requested to learn more about blacksmithing. He told me to try my hand making a few shoes, as he had need about 20 with the sizes and quantities needed on a chart by the work table. Josephus and Scott went inside the house to talk about starting up a stable for the racehorses. I looked at the sizes needed and decided to start with the smallest first. These were almost half size and must have been for a pony. He needed 4 of these, and I started by heating the iron and then creating the shape over the horn of the anvil. Next, I flattened it and placed a chisel into the center of it, creating a depression. I heated it again and placed the holes at regular intervals. Lastly, I created the lips at the heel of and a smaller one at the tip. Final heating and check, and I dropped it in the water. I matched it to the blank on the board. It was close, but a little wider than it was supposed to be. A quick heat and a pound or two with the hammer, and it matched. The rest of them came easier. I did have to make minor adjustments, but by the end, they all turned out. I was finishing the last one when Scott and Josephus came out of the house. Scott went into the barn to set up for business while Josephus checked over my work. Good work, Don. Once we have the horses in front of us, we'll make any adjustments necessary. He punched me in the arm with a pleased smile, bisecting his face. I don't have to teach you much. You seem to have a natural flair for this. I thanked him. I have a smattering of knowledge, but no practical experience. He went over to a barrel and of assorted plates of iron and pulled out a rod and a disc. Brought them over and laid them on the work table in front of me. How'd you make that into a skillet? Can you tell me that? Josephus sat down on a stack of wood and leaning his back against the wall with his arms crossed over his chest. I looked at the disc and said, well, first I'd heat this and rotating it, pounded it wider to the size I needed, then a reheat and bend up the sides, holding it at an angle on the anvil. Finally a check, reheat, and adjust for any errors. The rod gets flattened out and made into a handle. Josephus was sitting nodding as I spoke and waved his hand for me to get to it. I had to reheat more often than I thought I would, but by turning and hammering, it slowly took shape. I worked carefully as there was a sort of artistry about this I liked. I had the skillet nearly done to my satisfaction. As an afterthought, I had a small pouring lip on one side. The handle was done faster, but still allowed for a little embellishments. I added a hole to hang it and even placed a small set of marks on it as a sort of trademark. I handed them to Josephus for inspection. I like the added touches. They increase the value of things and personalize them. Items like these will fetch a pretty good price. Join them up and see if you can get about 5 more done before quitting time. I'll just check on how Scott's doing and then we can call it a day. I was curious about that as the day was still young. Scott had been banging away all the time. I was working, but it was quieter now. I took a break and walked into the barn. Scott had set up stalls and added a saddle and stand outside each. There were hooks on the walls for tack, and it only holds about 8 horses, but that'd do to get them started. I then found out why we were quitting early. There was to be another race, and it would start this evening. I finished the 5 into 3 skillets and 2 pots. Josephus had me draw up the mark I had been making on the pieces and add it to a sign on the wall stating all the merchandise with this brand was made by Don Skelton. Made me proud. I was determined to see if they were worth anything when I got back to my own century. Josephus provided us with a quick meal of bread, cheese, and a few slices of smoked ham. We gulped down a couple of pints of ale, too. I was glad the day had been cool, as working over the forge was hot work. We were just about to leave when Dan Jr. showed up. Josephus headed up to the races and said he'd save us a spot while Scott and Dan discussed business. Scott proudly showed the renovations he had done and talked about seeing if he could drum up business at the races. Dan asked to be the one to drum up customers with a commission of $5 for each horse he garnered. Scott agreed, and we all headed up to the races. Scott and I joined Josephus. I went over to place a bet on the first race. Josephus didn't know the owners or riders, but he did know the horses. Race number 1 was between Toronado and Lucifer. I took a fancy to Lucifer as he was a well-built horse with fire in his eyes. I placed $2 on him and walked around the horses gathered near the starting point. Dan was discussing the horses with their owners. He seemed knowledgeable about a horse's good and bad points, and the horses seemed pleased with him. They nuzzled him and prodding him with their noses. I figured he would eventually get around to soliciting customers, but was proving to them his knowledge and affinity. Scott seemed to have chosen better than he knew. I went back and rejoined Scott and Josephus for the first race. It was starting to get darker, so torches were brought up and lighted along the track. Dr. Hezekiah Worth was called on to be the judge at the far end. He mounted a fine-looking roan and, once at the far end, raised a handkerchief signaling all was in readiness. Both horses were at the starting line, and you could see the flanks quivering in readiness. The young man I saw working the farm was set up as a starter and fired off a sort of blunderbuss. It must have been lightly loaded because it wasn't near as loud as I expected. The horses took off like the wind and were at the far end in moments. The doctor raised 2 handkerchiefs signifying her tie. Both horses came back at a trot and were wiped down with cool water. Soon they were back at the starting line for another go. Josephus yelled at the starter to give it a double load this time. Samuel, who I found out was the starter's name, poured more powder in and readied the gun. He raised the gun and fired. Both horses leapt off the starting line at the sound of the report. A gust of wind as the horses blew by, and all eyes looked down the line. Once again, 2 handkerchiefs were raised, and both horses trotted back. Wiped down and placed in readiness, the owner of Lucifer was pacing, his face a mask of anger, but the owner of Toronado was grinning like the Cheshire Cat. He called his rider over, and I could just barely hear him tell him to let the horse go. Once more, they lined up. The gun was primed and ready. A moment of hesitation, and they reported the fired gun. This time, both horses took off with Toronado eating up the ground and with furious strides. He beat Lucifer by a head. As the horses came back, Dan congratulated Toronado's owner and asked for the honor of cooling the horse off and brushing him, a request that was graciously accepted. I was pretty sure that Scott would have at least one client by the end of the evening. The next race was between Jack Finney's horse, Dan Patch, and Chesapeake. This time there was a clear winner right off. Dan Patch won easily. Chesapeake and his rider came walking back slowly, the horse walking with his head hanging low. Dan walked up to Chesapeake as the rider was dismounting and the owner came up. Dan was petting the horse and talking to the rider. Forgive me saying so, but you hadn't choked up too much. His head was raised too high. I think that was what slowed him down. Chesapeake's owner looked Dan over. Dan was smallish and slight, but he showed strength in his arms and intelligence in his eyes. Tell you what, if I can get another race, how would you like to see if you're right? I could see Dan was eager for the chance. It's a deal, he said, and got the horse ready. The original rider went over and sat under a nearby tree, chewing on a piece of grass and throwing rocks in the water. The owner must have been successful because he was soon back and told Dan to bring the horse up to the starting line. Dan Patch was in residence on the other side. I watched as Dan Jr. centered himself in the saddle and rose slightly. His toes were pointed down and the balls of his feet resting in the stirrups. He held the reins loosely, giving the horse his head with just enough light control. Samuel let out a crack from his gun and both horses were off. Dan Patch was fast, there was no denying it, but Chesapeake in Dan Jr.'s hand was faster. Chesapeake won by half a horse length. There were 2 more races, and in each one, Dan Jr. talked to the owners. With the winners, it was congratulations. With the losers, suggestions on what went wrong, in his opinion. The race with him as rider and the success he had gave him an air of authority that displaced his youth. The owners listened. If they did not agree, at least they paid him the compliment of respectful listening. That night, the stables had 4 new customers, and Dan Jr. had $20 on a new position. On the way back on the ferry, Dan was full of enthusiasm for his new job. Scott expressed admiration for Dan's equestrian knowledge. Dan smiled. I love horses and always wanted to spend more time with them. The ferry keeps me occupied, though. I'll talk to my dad about letting my younger brother take over a ferry. If not, I think I may know a way that I can do both. But let's take things one step at a time. Once on the other side of the river, Scott and I slowly walked home. On the way, we stopped at an inn for a late dinner. We didn't get a menu. At this place, you ate what they have. The stew was very good, and ale wasn't bad. We sat and listened to the many conversations around us. Most were about the hostilities between the colonists and England. I looked quickly at Scott. He shook his head. We already discussed this, Don. We can't interfere. I understood his reasoning, but still had hopes that sometime in the future we would find out if we really could change the past. We spun out our ale for a while, playing dominoes and listening to the talk around us. Don ordered a small cask of ale to be delivered to the blacksmith's tomorrow. I must have been more tired than I thought because Scott had to rouse me and get me back to the inn. The next morning was cool and wet as a rainstorm was in full blow. Of course, we hadn't bought any rain gear, so we got drenched heading to the ferry. Dan's brother was now guiding the ferry, and today being wet, he was under a makeshift canopy. Franklin was his name, and he was a tall lad for his age. Dan Jr. stood by to ensure Franklin could handle the ferry in the choppy water. He must have had plenty of experience because he had everything well in hand. On the trip down, Scott and Dan talked over the plans for the day. I was trying to figure out what else I wanted to learn or what else Josephus had for me. While Scott and Dan went to the back to work on the stables, Josephus had me make a bucket of nails and some more skillets. He was placing the ones I had made yesterday on the wall to sell them. So I was to receive half the profits. I made some skillets, but I tried an idea. Instead of a normal handle, I bent a rod into an open weave pattern that terminated into a rounded back. Josephus asked the reason for it. I said the open weave would keep the handle cooler, or at least help to cool it off quickly once away from the fire. He took it into the house and came out later with it. Well, it works, was all he said, and placed it up on the wall at a little higher price. Early today, the inn delivered Scott's barrel, and we all had a refresher at lunch. The forge was so hot, several times I jumped into the river and came back soaking wet, only to be dry in 10 minutes. I took a break mid-afternoon to deliver some hooks and nails Dan had asked me to make. The barn looked a lot better today. The horses had plenty of hay, and Dan had rigged up a rain barrel with pipes going to the troughs for water. The water was released when someone pushed on a pedal connecting to the first pipe. The manure was taken out and was placed under an old sailcloth canvas painted black to break it down, and they would sell what remained to the farms or take hay in exchange. Scott and Dan had set up a pay schedule for themselves. At 1/6% of profit going to the blacksmith as rent, 1/4 to Scott as manager, and the rest to Dan as he'd be the one primary worker. Scott told Dan he would eventually drop out, leaving Dan in charge, but would take then 1/6% to be deposited in town for 2 years. After that, it would become Dan's alone. Scott and Dan were gone for a while to the bank to set up an account. We all had a nightcap and split up for the night. Josephus promised that tomorrow he'll teach me casting after we create a fence for one of the houses in town. Josephus said we would get $25 for this. He offered me half if I helped with the install. On the way home, we bumped into Ben Franklin. He invited us to dinner that night at the home of Samuel Prescott. He was on his way there and said he would let them know we would be coming in a bit. We rushed back to the inn for a quick wash-up and change, and it was only as we walked back that we realized we had no idea where the Samuel Prescott lived. We asked at the desk regarding the home of Mr. Prescott. We were informed it was Dr. Prescott, and he lived about 4 blocks down the street. Walking down the street, I tried to remember if I knew anything about Dr. Prescott. Well, other than his sending out Paul Revere and William Dawes on their midnight ride, and acting as a writer himself, I was at a loss. Scott added a bit to what I knew, and as he had read about the Prescott family, he was big on patriotism and that Samuel was a member of Sons of Liberty and a courier for the Americans. He was in town to give a report to Congress. I'm just checking to see how much, I forget how much farther we got. And this is a long one, so we're going to keep going though. We found his address and the door was opened as we walked up. Mr. Franklin told us of your arrival as our guest and his, you are welcome. Ben Franklin broke off from his group and introduced us to the gentleman who had welcomed us. He was indeed our host, Dr. Samuel Prescott. We expressed ourselves delighted to meet him. Scott, Ben, and Samuel rejoined the group talking while I went over to a corner by the fire. There were 2 chairs facing towards the fire, and I went to the outermost one and immediately excused myself when I saw someone sitting there. To add to my consternation, the person seated was John Adams. He motioned for me to take the other chair. I sat there at a loss for anything to say. I was overwhelmed by this great patriot. Mr. Adams inquired as to my health and I to his. He seemed depressed, and I asked if there was anything I could do. No, thank you, sir. I have merely returned from returning my family to my home in Massachusetts. I said I hoped they were all well. My wife is a pillar of strength in these troubled times, and I value her intelligence highly. She has been mostly self-taught and has given much thought to a variety of subjects. I only wish some of my congressional brethren had her clarity of reasoning. He looked over the side of his chair at Franklin. A brilliant mind, but lacking in that seriousness that would give weight to his words and deeds. However, his greatest asset is that very humor which allows unpalatable ideas to be better swallowed. He shook his head and was about to settle back in his chair when dinner was announced. Scott and I were seated at the bottom of the table together. In such august surroundings, I felt disinclined to talk. I think the saying goes, better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to open up your mouth and relieve all doubt. So I sat and listened. Scott contributed to the discussion on finance and transitioning certain businesses from civilian to wartime and which would best be converted. And in the meantime, we ate. Dr. Prescott asked to be forgiven for the scarcity of the meal. We had salad, squirrel soup, turkey, pumpkin, and squash cooked with walnuts and chestnuts, and biscuits. For my part, I thought there was plenty and excellently prepared. I was savoring the wine and must have had a contemplative look because Dr. Prescott smiled and asked my opinion of the wine. I said that it seemed to me to be a Sauterne from the Bordeaux region of France. Dr. Prescott was amused at my guess because it was correct. I was asked the reasons for my correctly naming the area and discussed the region of Bordeaux, the age of the vines, and the elevation. It was one of the few parts of the dinner I could actually speak intelligently on. Scott got that pleased look peculiar to him when someone knows something and he doesn't, and he listened intently. The dinner ended early as everyone had a long day and had a longer one tomorrow. We thanked our host and walked back to the hotel. The inn was quiet when we walked in. We sat as we had been doing by the fire and talked. Scott had been talking for a while, but in a distracted way, and seemed to as if he was trying to come to a decision. At last he stood up and motioned for me to come up the stairs. Please bring a chair from your room into mine. We need to talk. I did as he asked and wondered what he wanted. When I arrived at Scott's room, he had already placed his chair close to the fireplace. He pointed for me to place mine across from him. This room seems oddly suitable for the disclosure of confidences, was his first remark. For reasons of my own, I feel the time is appropriate to give you certain information regarding my past and our future travels. I tried to give an indication of utmost patience. Scott, once he gets going, can talk for a long time, and I sat back in my chair and waited. He smiled when he saw me lay back in my chair. It is not my intention to hold you here long, but you have often questioned my obsession with time travel. Today is the day I set that obsession in place. I stared open-mouthed at Scott. He had been obsessed with time since I knew him. Yet he had set the obsession today. I have always said the past, present, and future are interconnected, and today is my absolute proof. He handed me two passbooks, one fresh and new, and the other old and barely hanging together. On closer inspection, I realized that they were the same passbook from the same bank. It was the account Scott had set up for this morning. I looked closer at the dates of the old book, and they covered the time from today all the way up to 1986. I looked at Scott for an answer, which he promptly supplied. When I created my account this morning, I realized that a circle had closed. He leaned back in his chair and his eyes held a dreamy expression. When I was 22, I joined the Air Force, as I have told you. I had just finished basic training in my tech school, and my first base was RAF Mildenhall in England. I went home on leave, then had to go through Philadelphia to catch my plane. I got there 2 days early to do some sightseeing, and I was passing this very bank, he tapped the passbook, when I had an odd urge to open an account. I had plenty on me from basic and tech school. I went inside and was going to deposit a few hundred to start it. When I approached the counter, I was informed that my account was still current and would I like to deposit the $300 in it. I told him I didn't have any account, didn't have any passbook. She asked if it was in my safety deposit box. The clerk held out their key and asked for mine. On my keychain was a similar key I had found in my room one day and had kept on my keychain ever since. I handed it over. Until that moment, I had never figured out what it unlocked, but I found it with a note telling me to never lose it. He had his eyes closed, and he paused so long I thought he had gone to sleep, but he had simply been collecting his thoughts. We went to the boxes, and when they pulled mine, I was ushered to a booth for privacy. I was seriously shaking as I opened the safety deposit box. It contained an assortment of coins from various centuries and locations, France, Egypt, America, etc. Also, there was this passbook and a stack of receipts. All the receipts were signed with my signature, and all the receipts covered the years starting from the date of its beginning to the day I walked in. That's 210 years in 25-year intervals. There were over $5 million in this account. I traded the passbook for a new one, took a couple of thousand, and placed the receipts and coins in my pocket. I framed the coins. You may have seen them on the wall in my home. Burned the receipts, but replaced the old and new passbooks in the safety deposit box. I stayed in the Air Force for only 4 years, but they were the longest years I've ever known. I felt I knew what Edmond Dantes must have felt knowing that he had a possible treasure waiting for him, whereas mine was a certainty, and I was assured of it. His eyes were shining at the memories unfolded in his mind. Anyway, after my term of service was up, I went back to Philadelphia. I hate to admit it, but I burned through $1 million of it far fast in less than a year. After realizing what I was doing, I became more frugal. I also created a few things and had them patented. The money I made off those inventions easily made back the $1 million I had spent. I invested half of my money and used the rest to go to school and began the researches that would enable me to build a time machine. I realized it was not only possible, but it was certain that I would be able to create it and set in motion the events that had been realized in 1986. Years of research brought me to the point of being able to create it. When you arrived on the scene, I was going to go back and to try and learn some programming skills that I was lacking. Thankfully, you arrived with the skills appropriate to our needs. You have been of inestimable value to the production of our machine, and you have been a great and trusted friend. I could feel my face turning red, and Scott stopped speaking for a moment. Our travels have been the highlight of my life, and I appreciate you being part of this. I look forward to our trip to New Salem, and then I would like to visit Rome in its glory days. But we will discuss Rome later. And now, my friend, go and get some sleep. We have big days ahead of us. He slowly stood up, and creaking and popping as he did, and patting my shoulder, he went to bed. I think we're getting, about 4 more pages. Good grief. I hoisted my chair and brought it back to my room. I wrapped myself in a blanket and sat looking out the window, my mind going over what Scott had disclosed. I kept thinking it was sort of a chicken and the egg problem. Trying to work it out was giving me a headache, so I gave up and went to bed. All night my dreams were of traveling from one time to another, with the change sometimes changing from moment to moment. It made for a restless night, and I was slightly late getting downstairs in the morning. We're going to stop this. This is a very long chapter. Granted, we've only got about 4 chapters left. And then comes transitions. That one's a short chapter, so we'll do the rest of this chapter and transitions next time we get together, which will be tomorrow. So I appreciate you coming by. I appreciate you listening in. I hope you're enjoying these. Really would like some comments here. That would let me know that you're enjoying this or not, or how you feel about these things. Let me know how you like our books, not only mine, but those that we've read in the past. I'm kind of circulating the videos on my website, on my YouTube channel, so that way if you just drop by my site, then you can see a new one all the time. So I appreciate you dropping by. I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Have a good day, and oh my God, I swear to God, that's root beer. But okay, I will see you tomorrow. We'll get going with the rest of the chapter and with the, which one did I say we were going to do? God, my mind's like a sieve. Transitions. So that's right before they go see Lincoln. So, all right. You have a good day, and we'll talk again tomorrow. Bye.